July 6th, 2018, 6.5 years ago. That is the last time Israel Adesanya has competed on a UFC Fight Night card. On that night, we would see him defeat Derek Brunson in what would launch him into championship contendership status, where he would face Anderson Silva, go on to face Kelvin Gastelum in an all-timer for the interim title, and then the rest is history after that. And over that 6.5 year stretch that spans 13 fights, 12 of them consecutively now at this point, leading into this fight night against Imavov, were for UFC gold, were for the UFC middleweight championship of the world, and well, that one random one for the light heavyweight championship of the world. So back in July of 2018, the last time Adesanya had been on a UFC fight night, well, the next day, Daniel Cormier would go on to become the heavyweight champion of the world by knocking out Stipe Miocic. Tom Aspinall, the current interim heavyweight champion of the world, was still 2 years away from making his UFC debut. Kayla Harrison, the two-time PFL champion, the two-time Olympic gold medalist, and now the 2-0 UFC fighter gunning for a bantamweight championship opportunity, she had one professional fight. Dricus du Plessis, former rival and opponent of Israel Adesanya, the current sitting middleweight champion of the world, 1 week out from his next title defense at UFC 312 against Sean Strickland, he was in KSW. Khamzat Chimaev, the undefeated phenom coming for a middleweight championship in this 185-pound weight class, he had one professional fight. And Zhang Weili, the current strawweight champion of the world in the UFC, also slated to defend her strawweight title next week at UFC 312. Well, 1 month away from that July 6, 2018 date, August 4th of 2018, that is when she made her UFC debut. That is how much the landscape of the Ultimate Fighting Championship has changed since Israel Adesanya was on a fight night card. And now here we are, February 1st, 2025, and he is back facing Nassourdine Imavov on a fight night card and in a non-scheduled title bout. And I feel like that's been the biggest storyline going heading into this fight night card is what is the motivation for Israel Adesanya? What is in it for him, being that this isn't for a title, being that even if he wins, he may not be next for a title given all of his opponents. You know, he's already faced Dricus and lost. He's already faced Sean Strickland and lost, right? Will he really be next with a victory over Imavov? Time will tell. So a lot of people I've been hearing on like SiriusXM and in the MMA community on social media, they're kind of just wondering what is the motivation for Israel Adesanya? How up is he? How game is he for this type of fight against someone that isn't a big name, that is a dangerous opponent, and that could, with a loss to Imavov, set Adesanya back potentially for the rest of his career in this middleweight weight class. But to me, I'm on the other side of the spectrum. At 35 years old, proven all that he has proven, the multi-time title defenses, 5 if I'm not mistaken, challenging up a weight class at 205 pounds, rivalries with Alex Pereira, with Dricus du Plessis, with Sean Strickland, a duo of fights with middleweight great Robert Whittaker. He's done everything there is to do in the sport and specifically at 185 pounds, and yet he is still returning to face someone who's dangerous, who doesn't have the name value that Israel Adesanya does in Nassourdine Imavov. To me, that speaks volumes about where the headspace of Adesanya is. It shows me that he is still hungry to prove he is amongst the elite of the elite in the UFC, in this weight class, and that he is still hungry to regain the title that he was once at the top of the throne with 2 separate times. But standing across from him is someone who is a legitimate threat to anyone in this weight class, including the champion Dricus du Plessis, including his challenger Sean Strickland, and including Israel Adesanya. The 29-year-old out of Paris, France, Nassourdine Imavov, is coming into this fight against Israel Adesanya on the hottest stretch of his UFC career, having not lost a fight in over 2 years, dating back to January 14th, 2023, and that was to Sean Strickland, who would go on to win the championship, and now, a week from this Saturday, is challenging for the title again. Imavov is now on a 4-fight unbeaten streak since that loss to Strickland. It started with a no contest against Chris Curtis due to an accidental clash of heads, but since then, 3 consecutive victories, and all against ranked opponents. Roman Dolidze, a finish over former title challenger Jared Cannonier, and a victory over the surging at that time Brendan Allen, most recently in September of last year. Imavov is a bit of a Swiss Army knife. Not great or amazing in any one particular area that's going to jump off the page more so than others, but he is solid and well-versed in all facets of mixed martial arts, from the striking, from the clinch work, to the grappling, defensive striking. He checks all of the boxes. He has a very large physical frame, long, rangy. He's shown that he can go 5 rounds in multiple fights at this point in his career. 25 minutes with Roman Dolidze, nearly 25 minutes with Jared Cannonier before the finish, and a 15-minute decision over Brendan Allen. Not to mention, in that last loss he had to Sean Strickland, that was a 25-minute fight in a main event, and that was a very close fight, albeit Strickland did get the decision nod. And while some may be questioning the motivation for Israel Adesanya, you can't really question the motivation for Nassourdine Imavov, because this is the biggest opportunity of his career. And if he gets a victory on Saturday night in Saudi Arabia against the former 2-time champion Israel Adesanya, one of the biggest names in the UFC's history, especially over the last decade, then nothing else can be next for Imavov except for a championship opportunity against the winner of Dricus du Plessis versus Sean Strickland. Now, I know in the intro to this I talked about the undefeated phenom that is Khamzat Chimaev, who's coming off of starching Robert Whittaker. You could easily say that he should get the winner of du Plessis versus Strickland, and I wouldn't bat an eye at that either. But I am saying that if Imavov wins and makes it 4 consecutive victories, all against ranked opponents, against former champions, against former title challengers, he at minimum should not have to fight anyone else. He has earned his shot to fight for the title, whether that be immediately after UFC 312 or whether that be after Khamzat Chimaev faces the winner of UFC 312. Imavov has arrived and is here to stay should he get the victory over Adesanya. Dare I say, he could even be a future UFC champion. And while there are doubters for Israel Adesanya and questions about his career and what could be next and what is going to happen in this specific fight from an X's and O's and performance standpoint, he is still the betting favorite at the time I'm recording this on Thursday morning, a minus 160. On the comeback is Imavov around a plus 135, plus 140. I think this is going to be a very competitive fight. I think it's going to be a very high level fight, but I will say that tit for tat, toe to toe, if it's on the feet for 25 minutes, I do have a hard time seeing Adesanya losing this bout. I'm going to be quite honest with you. If we go back to his fight against Dricus du Plessis, which was last August at UFC 305, where we would see Adesanya lose via face crank submission, the 3rd loss of his last 4 fights. Up until that moment where he had to submit due to the face crank, I thought he looked incredible in this comeback fight against Dricus du Plessis. I thought it was the best, most well-rounded performance that Adesanya has put on since, honestly, I have to go back to his Marvin Vettori fight in June of 2021. In that fight against Vettori, Adesanya showcased his incredible striking skills, but also his defensive grappling improvements and his offensive wrestling as well. Now, of course, he had victories after that. Robert Whittaker, Jared Cannonier, he had the knockout win over Alex Pereira, but from a full 25-minute perspective, or close to 25 minutes, I thought Adesanya was as sharp as ever in that fight against du Plessis, but he just ended up getting caught. But if he comes out and fights the same way he did against DDP, I have a hard time seeing Imavov being able to compete with him in the striking. But if Imavov implements a heavier pressure, putting Adesanya on the back foot, pressing him against the cage, getting him in the clinch, maybe even getting him down to the mat, much like Dricus du Plessis pushed forward and attempted to do and found success in as the fight went on, that is where this fight could get very interesting, could get very close, and could even be the path to victory for Imavov to make it 4 straight wins. So I'm very curious to hear from you all in the comments below. What are your predictions for this main event? Israel Adesanya, Nassourdine Imavov. Can Izzy solidify himself as still amongst the elite of the elite? And can Imavov solidify himself as a true threat to the middleweight division's champion, no matter who sits atop the throne? And from the UFC Saudi Arabia main event, we will now transition into the rest of the card, and it starts in the co-main event of the evening, where the undefeated 30-year-old Shara Bullet, Shara Magomedov, the current number 14 ranked middleweight in the world, will be taking on the longtime Bellator veteran turned UFC 2-fight alum thus far, Michael Venom Page. Shara Magomedov has made good on his UFC career thus far, dating back to October 21st, 2023. In his debut, he is 4-0 under the promotion's banner with 2 decisions and 2 knockouts, including a Knockout of the Year nominee in 2024, the double spinning back fist against Armen Petrosyan in his last outing at UFC 308 in October. 3 of those 4 victories for Shara in the UFC all came in 2024, a low-key Fighter of the Year nominee, if we're being honest, and now he will look to capitalize on his 2025, and by the end of the year, if he gets 3 fights in like he did last year, he's going to be right amongst the title contender talk heading into 2026. He is a legit threat anywhere that the fight goes on the feet with his rangy strikes, kicks, as you can see, a wide arsenal of weapons when you talk about someone who had a double spinning back fist, something that had never been seen before in the UFC's history. But standing across the cage from Shara is another well-versed, long, rangy striker, 7 years the elder, Michael Venom Page. MVP made his long-awaited UFC debut in March of 2024 at UFC 299, where he put on a shutout performance against Kevin Holland, an absolute striking clinic where from minute 1 to minute 15, Kevin Holland never even really got a chance. And he would fight again 3 months later, June 29th of 2024 at UFC 303 International Fight Week, this time against the undefeated, at that point, Ian Machado Gary in a very competitive back and forth fight that could have gone either way if you ask me. The judges did give the unanimous decision to Ian Machado Gary, but it did not come easy for Gary, and MVP put up a hell of a fight in my opinion. At 22-3 overall with 16 finishes, Michael Venom Page was one of the biggest names in Bellator MMA's history, the face of their promotion at certain points throughout his career as well, and while he never got to that point of being a champion for that promotion, he pretty much did everything else there was to do, and now he has transitioned into the UFC, been a part of 2 very good fights thus far, and I think here against Shara Magomedov, we have the makings for a potential chess match on the feet or a potential fight of the night banger. Regardless, the winner of this being MVP or Shara Magomedov says a lot about their future, because this is a perfect stylistic clash for both of these fighters to see if they can fare well with another solid striker in their same weight class. The winner of this fight inches nearer in this welterweight top 10. In the featured bout of the evening, we go to the big boys in the heavyweight division as the number 4 ranked Sergei Pavlovich will look to end his 2-fight skid, and to do so, he will have to defeat the number 9 ranked Jairzinho Biggie Boy Rozenstruik. Heading into November of 2023, Sergei Pavlovich was on a 6-fight win streak, a 6-fight knockout win streak, a 6-fight first round knockout win streak. And look at the resume during that stretch. Derek Lewis, Tai Tuivasa, and Curtis Blades. Those latter 3 names led him to facing Tom Aspinall for the interim heavyweight championship in November of 2023 in Madison Square Garden at UFC 295, a fight that was originally supposed to be John Jones versus Stipe Miocic with Pavlovich as the backup fighter. It instead turned into Aspinall versus Pavlovich for the interim championship, and that fight would just go 9 seconds over the 1-minute mark before Aspinall would knock out Sergei Pavlovich. And we've seen what Tom Aspinall has done since then. He has went on to defend that interim title against Curtis Blades via knockout, and we've seen John Jones finally defend his heavyweight championship against Stipe Miocic in November of last year at UFC 309. So on the surface, it's a loss to Tom Aspinall, the second best heavyweight in the world, right? Maybe even the best heavyweight in the world. Pavlovich could surely bounce back from that, and he tried to do so at last year's UFC Saudi Arabia card, headlined by Robert Whittaker and Ikram Aliskerov, where he took on Alexander Volkov, former training partner, and in that fight, Volkov would piece up Pavlovich for 15 straight minutes en route to a unanimous decision victory. Volkov point-fighted his way to a very convincing win, in my opinion. One of the best performances for a full 15 minutes that we have seen Volkov put on in quite some time. He looked incredible in that fight. You could say he even has won another fight since then when he faced off against Cyril Gane at UFC 310 in December. That's a bit controversial. We'll leave that for the next Volkov fight discussion. But regardless, we now see Pavlovich, who was once the most dangerous man on the UFC's roster, coming into this fight on a 2-fight skid. Can he bounce back against the high-level kickboxer that is the biggie boy, Jairzinho Rozenstruik? The 36-year-old Jairzinho Rozenstruik has won 3 of his last 4 fights, including a 2-0 2024 with a doctor stoppage victory over Shamil Gaziev, who's also competing on this card, and a split decision over Tai Tuivasa. Most recently, that was in August of 2024 at UFC 305. His only loss in the last 2 years was to Jailton Almeida, and that was in May of 2013 where he got submitted in the first round, and we've seen how well that loss has aged since. And I'll be honest, Rozenstruik has pretty much fought everyone there is to face in this heavyweight division outside of Sergei Pavlovich, and if he gets a victory here, that will be his 3rd straight win. It'll be against a top 5 opponent who has fought for an interim title before in Pavlovich. Don't be surprised if Rozenstruik doesn't have to fight anymore to challenge for the title. Now, I know that that's a long, curvy, winding road because we don't know what's going on with John Jones and Tom Aspinall. Will they fight? Is John retiring? If so, Tom Aspinall is without an opponent. Does that mean he could face Jairzinho Rozenstruik in his first true defense if Biggie Boy wins here? I don't know, but there are definitely big implications for this fight. For Rozenstruik to launch himself into contention and for Pavlovich to keep himself in contention. And kicking off the main card is a pair of back-to-back really intriguing fights if you ask me. First, here in the bantamweight division, it's Said Nurmagomedov, the 18-3 fighter out of Russia, against lockdog Vinicius Oliveira, 21-3. Said Nurmagomedov has went 7-2 in his UFC career dating back to July 2018 when he made his UFC debut, and the only losses to Raoni Barcelos in 2019. We've seen how that loss has aged. Barcelos is coming off of just beating another rising prospect a couple of weeks ago in Peyton Talbot. And in March of 2023, he lost to Jonathan Martinez, who at that time was on a very big win streak, a fight that featured 2 men on big win streaks. And the last time that we saw Said fight was October of 2023, where he got a submission in the first round over Muin Gafurov. So no fights in 2024, yet he's coming into this having won 5 of his last 6 overall. He is 32 years old, right in his prime. Of his 18 victories, 10 of them are by way of stoppage. Never been finished in his career, but it could all change this weekend because Vinicius Oliveira has finished 18 of his 21 victories. Oliveira took the UFC by storm in 2024. In his UFC debut against Bernardo Sopai, he got one of the most devastating flying knee knockouts in UFC history and a Knockout of the Year nominee for 2024, and he got that with just 19 seconds to go in the 3rd round of his fight with Sopai. Then, in his 2nd fight ever in the UFC, he would take on the former ranked bantamweight Ricky Simón and get a very convincing, borderline dominant decision win over him. So 2-0 in the UFC, a Contender Series alum, a very high finishing clip, just 29 years old. Vinicius Oliveira, with a win over Said Nurmagomedov, truly launches himself into the elite discussions of 135 pounds, arguably the deepest weight class in mixed martial arts right now. The winner of this fight, even if it's Said Nurmagomedov, they're getting a ranked opponent next. I would say even a borderline top 10 guy. And the first fight of the main card that I mentioned is in the lightweight division, and it is Faris Ziam versus Mike Beast Boy Davis. Ziam enters this fight on a 4-fight win streak, none more notable than his absolutely vicious knockout over Matt the Steamroller Favola in September of last year in the 3rd round, where he put him to sleep up against the fence. He's 6-2 overall in the UFC since debuting in 2019. He lost that debut fight, would go on to win 2 in a row, then lose to the ultra-dangerous Terrence McKinney, who's also competing at UFC Saudi Arabia. But since then, the 4-fight win streak, Michael Figlak, Jai Herbert, Claudio Puelles, and Matt Favola. So with a win here over Mike Davis, he's right there ready to face a top 15 lightweight next, but it will not be easy. The Beast Boy is 11-2, 32 years old, finished 9 of his 11 victories, and enters this fight on also a 4-fight win streak. Someone's streak must be stopped. Davis made his return to the octagon in March of last year with a submission over Natan Levy, his first fight since October of 2022, where he beat Slava Claus. And I think it's worth noting his only UFC loss was in his debut in 2019. It was against Gilbert freaking Burns. Are you kidding me? So although he's only had 5 total fights dating back to April of 2019, he hasn't been the most active guy. He still has potential, and he is still luckily in his prime years. So if he can stay injury-free, and if he can get a victory over Ziam to make it 5 in a row, he's now in the talks for top 15 territory. And then I want to discuss 2 fights on the prelims before we finish this discussion, and it starts in the heavyweight division, a bit of a weird one that I wouldn't probably normally talk about if it wasn't for a ranking being on the line. It is the number 14 Shamil Gaziev taking on Thomas Petersen. As we already talked about in the Rozenstruik versus Pavlovich breakdown, Gaziev lost to Biggie Boy in March of last year with a doctor stoppage at the end of the 4th round in their main event fight. Prior to that opportunity, he only had 1 UFC fight, and it was a win over Martin Buday, granted a 2nd round finish, but he was catapulted into a main event spot against a long-time top 10 ranked opponent in Jairzinho Rozenstruik, and I just felt that that inexperience was on full display, as even before the doctor stoppage, Biggie Boy had his way in that fight. Luckily for Shamil, he did bounce back in 2024 with a win over Dontel Mays in August via unanimous decision, so he's 13-1 overall. He's finished 11 of those 13 victories. He just finds himself in a weird spot. And the same can be said for Thomas Petersen, who only has 2 fights in the UFC since entering after his Contender Series win in 2023, and one of those 2 fights is a loss. He lost his UFC debut to Jamal Pogues, who's fighting on this card at UFC Saudi Arabia via decision, then bounced back in July of 2024 with a decision over brother of Kamaru Usman, Mohammed. 29 years old, 9-2 overall with 8 finishes to his name, a Contender Series alum. The hype, I guess, is there for Thomas Petersen, but it just feels like a strange bout with 2 guys that haven't really proven themselves yet are fighting for a ranked opportunity. I know heavyweight isn't all that stacked, it isn't all that deep. Maybe I'm playing too much into the ranking being on the line, but that's just how my brain works. I can't help it. And last but not least, one of the most anticipated fights for me on this card, if I'm being quite honest with you, it is a women's flyweight bout between Jasmine Jasudavicius and former bantamweight title challenger Mayra Bueno Silva. The 35-year-old Jasudavicius finds herself currently sitting at number 12 in the women's 125-pound division, and she's riding a 3-fight win streak heading into this bout. Most recently, a submission in the 3rd round over Ariane Lipski in November of 2024. She's been one of the most active fighters on the UFC's roster, specifically in the women's weight classes, since debuting back in January of 2022, following a September 2021 victory on the Contender Series. She's won 6 of her 8 UFC bouts, and the only losses, Natalia Silva, that was back in June of 2022, almost 3 years ago, and against someone who I feel is going to be a future champion, undoubtedly. And the other, Tracy Cortez, a longtime ranked opponent at this point in the flyweight division, and a pretty competitive fight overall where the grappling of Cortez just outweighed the grappling of Jasudavicius. But I do believe in the potential of Jasmine, and while yes, she is 35, she's not quite a spring chicken or in her prime per se, in a division that is very, very fun, very evolving, and I think the most complete division of the 3 in the women's divisions of UFC right now. Jasmine is a player, and she gets a big-time opportunity, not against a big-name flyweight, but against a big-name bantamweight in Mayra Bueno Silva, the current number 7 135-pounder in the world, who has competed at flyweight before in the UFC, but that was back in 2021. As a matter of fact, there was a stretch of about 5 or 6 fights before Mayra made her way to 135 pounds. She started with a victory in her debut against Jillian Roberson, then lost to Marina Moroz, then beat Mara Romero Barella, had a draw with Montana De La Rosa, and then lost to Manon Fior, the number 1 contender in this current state of the flyweight division. Then she would go on to fight in the women's bantamweight division, tallying off 3 and then kind of 4, but then having it overturned against Holly Holm, the most notable of the 4-fight win streak for Mayra Bueno Silva. But even though it got overturned to a no contest, she would still fight for the UFC title in January of last year at UFC 297 against Raquel Pennington, where she would lose via decision. And in Mayra's second fight of 2024, she would fall victim to Macy Chasson, a doctor stoppage about halfway through the second round. So having gone 0-2 at 135 pounds in 2024, it has sent Mayra Bueno Silva back down to her original UFC home, the flyweight division, and it's no easy task as she is taking on Jasmine Jasudavicius, someone who I'm very high on. I'm very intrigued at how this bout will play out. I want to see Jasmine continue to climb her way up, but I also am intrigued to see how Mayra Bueno Silva can reinsert herself potentially instantly in this 125-pound weight class. So that is it for all things UFC Saudi Arabia. This went a little bit longer than expected, so hope you are okay with a little bit longer of a preview video here. I usually only separate the main event discussions when they're pay-per-views because they're title fights, so I do them separately from the rest, but who cares? It's a little bit longer, so be it. That just means we've got a stacked fight night card. So drop a like and subscribe if you are new to the channel. Every single week you can expect the same here. Breakdowns and previews of the biggest fights, the best storylines, and what is at stake. I recap the most meaningful results from each card every week, and I give my thoughts and opinions on MMA news and fight announcements as well. You can join the community on social media at Verbal Spar MMA on X, Instagram, and TikTok, and you can follow on your favorite podcast platforms such as Spotify and Apple, where episodes release there every Monday and Friday. Have a great weekend, enjoy the fights, and I will see you in the next video.